Welcome, everybody. We're delighted to have with us Dr. Ibrahim Warde, who's an adjunct professor of international business at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University near Boston. He has a doctorate from the University of California at Berkeley and has recently completed a book called The Price of Fear, The Truth Behind the Financial War on Terror. And also he's written on Islamic finance in the global economy. We're very happy to have him here at AUB, and please join me in welcoming him.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's always a great pleasure to be at AUB since I grew up in Lebanon. So AUB certainly has a great place in the hearts of anybody who grew up here. So I'm going to talk about the financial war on terror, which is one aspect of the war on terror that most people don't quite understand, in that just about everything that's commonly believed about the financial war on terror is simply wrong. Now, to give you an illustration of the reach of the financial war on terror, I was walking past a table here that was collecting donations for the Gaza Strip. And I could say with a great deal of certainty that if I gave money, or if any of you gave money, then we could get in trouble with the U.S. government for funding terrorism. Okay? So that's the extent of the reach of the financial war on terror. Let me give you just another example of some of the excesses of this financial war on terror. Our Prime Minister, Mr. Sanura, a few years ago when he was Minister of Finance, one day he was notified by the American embassy in Beirut that his visa for the U.S. was being revoked because he had donated $600 for an Islamic charity in the year 2000. I think the action was taken in 2003 or so. So this was obviously undone after a few years, but this is just an illustration of all the bizarre aspects of the war on terror. So I'm going to just start with a quote that puts in some context all those bizarre aspects of the war on terror. This comes from a book that any of you who is interested in finance should probably read. The book is Liar's Poker, and it was written by Michael Lewis in 1986. In this book, he was talking about his experience being an investment banker in London. And I'm going to quote from the book. He said, he was basically explaining that one way for an investment banker to succeed is to be able to invent, quote, logical lies. And he said that nervous clients kept calling him, asking him why the dollar has gone has gone up or down, why this or that event had occurred. And he said that whenever he was asked about any movement in the financial markets, he would answer, several Arabs have sold massive holdings of gold for which they received dollars. They were selling these dollars for marks and thereby driving the dollar lower. And then he adds, most of the time, when markets move, no one has any idea why. A man who can tell a good story can make a good living as a broker. It was the job of people like me to make up reasons, to spin a plausible yarn. And it's amazing what people will believe. Selling out of the Middle East was an old standby, since no one had ever had any clue as to what the Arabs did with their money. No story involving the Arabs and their money could be refuted. Okay? So if you didn't know why the dollar was falling, you shouted out something about Arabs and their money. Okay? Now, if some of you are, again, involved in finance, you could probably relate to that, in that there is this area where anybody can say anything. And I think this goes a long way in explaining what I discuss in my book as the mythology of terrorist financing, in that there are really three things I'll be addressing. One is the whole discourse on terrorist financing. Then I'm going to talk about the politics behind the financial war on terror. And then I'll talk about the bureaucratic explanation for why
the financial war on terror operates the way it does. So you all know about this war on terror that started shortly after September 11, 2001. What you might not know is that this war on terror started on the financial front, in that the first action taken in the war on terror took place on September 24, 2001, and it involved freezing of assets. So there was a list of people whose assets were frozen, and President Bush made a big show when he announced that, and he also said that there will be many such announcements. So on average, about once a week after this announcement, there would be a similar announcement about more actions taken on the financial front. Many of those actions actually had a very, very broad impact. To cite some of those actions, like about 2 months later, there was a closing down of Al-Barakat, which is a money remittance business that was based in Dubai and in Somalia, which had a tremendous impact on Somalia and its status as a very poor state and as a failed state. And I think there's a direct connection between much of what's happening now with the piracy and what had happened then. Then to give you another sense of the action that were taken post September 11, initially the war on terror targeted, quote, terrorists with a global reach. So in order to obtain the cooperation of the entire world, certain groups such as Hamas and Hezbollah were not included in that list. Now, however, because of the political and the bureaucratic dynamics that I'll talk about later, little by little, with every subsequent announcement and with the ratcheting up of the war on terror, then just about every group would be included. And sure enough, a group like Hamas, for example, right now is pretty much at the center of this financial war on terror. And most of the stories that you hear about Islamic charities and the like have to do with people innocently making donations, such as one that you might have made today to this effort to collect money for Gaza. And basically that will label you as a funder of terrorism. So let's talk a little bit about what the discourse on terrorist financing is all about. Well, to understand why things happened the way they did on the financial front, we should go back to the context of September 11 and the sense of panic that was felt all over the US, and also a sense of embarrassment the administration felt because there had been a number of signals of intelligence agencies, etc., that something big was going to happen. And there's a presidential daily briefing that the president gets every day summarizing the various threats, etc., that's presented by the CIA to the president. And this briefing that President Bush received on August 6th of 2001 was titled Bin Laden Determined to Strike in the US. And this was only discovered by the general public about 4 or 5 years after the September 11 attacks. But that gives you a sense of the kinds of warnings that were out there. So the administration was caught in a bind following September 11 because on the day of the attacks, President Bush apparently asked Donald Rumsfeld, how long will it take us to hit Afghanistan? Because for obvious reasons, the administration knew right away that it was bin Laden and Al-Qaeda who were responsible. And Rumsfeld told Bush that it will take us 6 weeks. Now, 6 weeks is a very long time when you're a superpower and you need to act very swiftly. Now, luckily, a number of memoirs have appeared written by many of the people involved in those decisions in the years following September 11. And it's easy now to piece together what happened in terms of decision making. So the first weekend after the September 11 attack, there was a meeting at Camp David with all the principles involved in the war on terror. And again, this meeting was very well documented by people like Bob Woodward and others. And at that meeting, there was kind of a very kind of dark feeling in the room because nobody had a clue about what to do. They knew that it would take six weeks to get ready to hit Afghanistan, and yet something had to be done immediately. And this is how the idea of a financial strike came up. And there was an interesting exchange that day, and it's pretty much corroborated by all the accounts that we had, whereby President Bush was saying, okay, we should do something on the financial front. We should freeze the accounts of terrorists. Now, the problem with that is that 3 years earlier, in the summer of 1998, there were bombings of American embassies in Africa. And following those bombings, President Clinton froze all there was to freeze in terms of groups that were linked to Al-Qaeda. And so there wasn't much to freeze. And this is where actually I don't want to spend time kind of going back to retrieve the quote that I have in my book. But basically the person in charge of that was the general counsel at the Treasury Department, a man by the name of David Aufhauser, was put in charge of finding accounts to freeze. And so he had a very interesting quote, which was, it was a crazy weekend because we just went out there trying to figure out all the usual suspects and freeze their accounts. Now, the net result of what had happened was that the list of names of people whose accounts were frozen on September 24, 2001 was essentially the same list as the one that Clinton had frozen, plus a few names of organizations, many of which were defunct by then or were insignificant. But it was simply an example of the fact that you had what political scientists call a pseudo-event, where you had something that made the headlines and dominated those headlines for a few days. But in reality, if you were to look at the practical implications of that, nothing quite came out of that concretely, except for the symbolic value of this action, that it convinced the public that all the bad guys had their money frozen, okay? And I can go on and on about this, this first strike of the war on terror, but that will give you a sense of the fact that what the public perceives as meaning that it was discovered that a big terrorist attack was about to take place, and it was stopped because the money behind those attacks was frozen, is completely wrong. Most of what happened in the financial war on terror has nothing to do with that. It's mostly lots of symbolic actions, politically and bureaucratically driven actions that caused a lot of collateral damage. That's my argument in a nutshell. And yet at the same time, one of the great paradoxes of the financial war on terror is that it is the one front that has gone virtually unexamined. To give you an illustration of that phenomenon, most of the beliefs that could be traced back to the period after September 11 have been challenged in one way or another. Like, for example, the belief that there will be many more such attacks that would happen, etc. But on the financial front, the same statement that were made then are made today. And there's a metaphor that was extremely powerful, but that's completely wrong. It is the statement by President Bush that money is the oxygen of terror. So you go after the money, and you're going to put an end to terror. And every single time there was an action taken on the financial front, this oxygen metaphor, which sometimes is modified as lifeblood or any other synonyms, but it's basically the point that money is what makes terrorism possible. Therefore, you go after the money and you put an end to terrorism. Now, what I discovered when I went back and researched the subject was that one way of summarizing what was done after September 11 was to go after, quote, the $300 million bin Laden fortune. Now, what is interesting about this line about the $300 million bin Laden fortune is that when I was finishing up my book, so it must have been kind of late 2006 or so, I did a Google search of two phrases. One was $300 million and the other one was bin Laden. And I had, I think, something like 160,000 hits, which simply meant that every single time there was any reference to bin Laden's money, you would see this reference to his to this $300 million fortune. So I went back and looked at this factoid about where it came from, and it turned out that when bin Laden's name appeared on the radar screen in the mid-1990s at the State Department, some junior staffer was asked to go and look at the fortune of this man, bin Laden, because he was typically described as the Saudi billionaire. And so what this poor person did was to try and make what doesn't even rise to the back of the envelope calculation, but basically he said, okay, I'm going to figure out what's the total wealth of the bin Laden group and divide it by the number of sons in the family. So the figure was therefore $5 billion. I don't even know whether it was the correct figure for the bin Laden group. But certainly the number of sons thing was pretty much made up based on various evaluations, which also showed that there was a total ignorance of Islamic inheritance laws and the whole reality of the bin Laden business, which is that different members of the family had different kinds of shares, etc. But basically, this $300 million figure came from dividing a fictional number by another fictional number. And he came up with $250 million. So it was $5 billion divided by 20. And he came up $250 million, and he rounded it up to $300 million. And that became the canonic figure as far as bin Laden's money. And a lot of the financial war on terror was essentially a quest for that money. Now, occasionally, again, when you get into this kind of archaeological effort to figure out where a rumor came from or when a number was concocted, there are some turning points. And in this case, I think the turning point in popularizing the notion of the bin Laden fortune of $300 million happened, again, in the summer of 1998, following the African embassy bombings that I talked about. And so in August of 1998, there's a very sinister character that those of you who follow American politics probably know. His name is Stephen Emerson, whose specialty is, like, every time there was an attack anywhere, including the Oklahoma City bombing, he would go on television and said it's the Arab who did it, because that's the way they work, etc. And so this Stephen Emerson wrote, "Terrorists have become very sophisticated in laundering and disguising their funds. They use a variety of financial vehicles, front companies, charitable organizations, third-party bank accounts, etc., to disguise the location of their assets. Osama bin Laden's most impressive achievement has been his ability to shield from scrutiny and seizure his $300 million financial empire, held in a financial labyrinth of worldwide shell companies, co-investor, governmental entities, bank accounts, religious charities, and plain old blue-chip investments." And then there's kind of much more information about that. Now, that really became the source of a whole literature on terrorist financing, where basically everybody would take every single one of those categories and elaborate on that. And so there's a whole library of books on terrorist financing that are really constructed as essentially fleshing out what Emerson was talking about and naming names, etc. All of it is completely fictional. And again, in my book, I discuss the fictional origins of much of the discourse on terrorist financing simply because terrorist financing is really a fixture of pulp novels in general. If you look at the way in which popular literature depicts terrorist financiers, then it's pretty much the image of the James Bond villains. And incidentally, probably many of you have seen the recent James Bond movie, Casino Royale, who is kind of the next to last of the James Bond movies. That's all about terrorist financing. And so the fact that most people, and you probably know of the TV series 24, and I could go on kind of down the list of fictional treatments of terrorism. And when you look at this, the issue of money is always very central. So when, again, you look at these issues in a more rigorous fashion, you realize the kind of impact that fiction can have on policy making, but also the hold that fiction can have on the minds of the public, because this whole image justified a lot of what had been done politically. So now, what about the story of the reality of the bin Laden fortune? Well, in 1999, there had been a high-level American delegation that was sent to Saudi Arabia to look specifically at the question of the bin Laden fortune. And they learned at that time that the real inheritance of bin Laden was in the range of $20 million. And that in 1994, when the Saudi government deprived bin Laden of his citizenship, bin Laden was forced to sell his share of the business to his brothers. And then that share of the business was seized by the Saudi government, okay? Which meant that the whole story of bin Laden as a funder of terrorism was a fiction, that the reality of it was that bin Laden was as much a recipient of money as much as he had been a funder. And then if you look at the rest of his career in the Sudan and Afghanistan, then it is far more complicated than this image of like this billionaire, etc. So the US government knew, or should have known, as of 1999, that there was no truth to this story. But then the story actually made sense because it's, if you look at it from a political standpoint or from a bureaucratic standpoint, then it is, it's very believable. Now, the September 11 Commission, which actually looked at the whole story of September 11, issued alongside with it a terrorism monograph. And in that monograph, it was revealed that the story of bin Laden's fortune was an urban legend. It was something that was completely made up. Now, again, I won't go over all the details of those fictions, but in my book, I went back and looked at most of the common beliefs on terrorist financing, and just about every single one of them has a comparable pedigree. Now, back to this story of the money being the oxygen of terror. When you look at the money question, one thing you realize is that, and unfortunately, the acts of terror cost very little money, in that the whole September 11 attacks ended up costing $300 million. That was the amount of money that was transferred to the terrorists. And then later on, another thing I look at in some detail is the London bombings of July 2005. And for about 3 months after those bombings, the whole focus was on the question of money. Because, again, it's become almost like a reflex. Whenever there's an act of terror, money was the residual explanation. You would try and explain terrorists by money. And then 6 months after the attacks, Scotland Yard came up with an actual estimate of the cost of those attacks. And it turned out that the cost of these attacks was £500, and that the quote-unquote financier was one of the 4 suicide bombers whose day job was that of a substitute teacher. So it's not a job where you make a lot of money. And it simply shows that when you have this kind of focus on money, one of the political reasons why the focus is convenient is that you remove the focus on the whole issue of political grievances and all other political reasons why terrorism occurs. And you say basically it's all about money, therefore we're going to go after the money and terrorism will stop. Now, let me kind of talk a little bit more about the financial war on terror being a subset of financial sanctions or economic sanctions. And if you look at economic sanctions, you can understand the politics of the financial war. And here, let's stray a bit from the Middle East and look at Cuba. Okay, in Cuba, there's been for some 50 years now a system of economic sanctions whose purpose was to weaken the hold on power of the communist regime and cause regime change. Now, as you know, this hasn't worked, and Castro now, for health reasons, has stepped aside and his brother's in charge. But the regime actually was strengthened, if nothing else, by those sanctions. And yet, this whole logic of sanctions, and we see it with Iran and with Gaza, etc., is that the purpose is to weaken the regime, but somehow it ends up strengthening the regime because it causes, again, it justifies, for one thing, government repression. And anybody who would be vaguely sympathetic to the U.S. in those countries would then be accused of trying to undermine the regime, etc. There's a whole series of reasons why it doesn't make much sense to figure out or to assume that by constantly tightening the sanctions, you're going to have some positive political outcome. And but it's become something that's, again, politically and bureaucratically very useful. Politically, it's useful because railing against the country and imposing sanctions has become a manifestation of political impotence, in that very often when you can't do much about a certain situation, then you act on the financial front. And politically, it's become, if you're like an American politician, it would be very difficult to say anything against sanctions simply because it's politically very cheap to say, well, we're against Iran, we're against this and that, we're against Cuba, therefore we want to impose sanctions. And that's, I think, a very powerful explanation for why the financial front is so impermeable to any kind of criticism, etc. Now, to give you some examples, in 1996, there were a couple of very controversial legislations imposed in the U.S. that had clauses of extraterritoriality. One was against Cuba, one was against Libya and Iran, which basically said that even companies from third countries that do business with these countries can be sued in U.S. courts. And if you look at the passage of these legislations in the U.S. Congress, it was overwhelming. One of them, I think, even had zero opposition in both the House of Representatives and in the Senate. So it tells you something about what could be kind of in simple terms. It would be to say that financial sanctions are good politics, but bad policy. They're good politics because you make political hay out of it, but it's bad politics because of the impact of it. So one way of measuring the politics element of it is to see if terrorism has stopped indeed because of those sanctions. And the reality of it, and again, I won't give you the figures, but basically the State Department puts out every year a list of the number of terrorist attacks. And the reality of those figures is that every year since 2003, terrorist attacks worldwide have increased. Okay, so if you use that criterion, then you would realize that first of all, assuming that money, the oxygen of terrorism, doesn't make sense as a metaphor, and then saying that the financial war on terror is a success is certainly not the case if the way of measuring success or failure is to look at again the end of acts of acts of terror. And yet at the same time, the September 11 report, the September 11 Commission, which was dismantled but functions as a kind of a think tank, has issued a report card to the American government in 2005 where every aspect of the war on terror received a grade. Now, most grades were in the range of C and D. The one good grade that the government received was on financial matters, where the financial front of the war on terror was given an A minus. Okay? Now, you might ask yourself, like, how to explain this contradiction? Well, most people look at the actions of the so-called financial warriors in terms of the process, meaning that the more you talk about it, the more sanctions you impose, the more measures you take, then it means that the more successful you are at what you're doing. Whereas you lose track of the actual result of it. Now, another thing, occasionally when I talk about that in Washington, one thing I like to mention to people who are involved in politics is an interesting line by Albert Einstein, which is that his definition, Einstein's definition of madness, is doing the same action over and over while expecting a different outcome. And that's pretty much a metaphor for a lot of what has been going on in terms of finance, because if you look, for example, at the US and Iran, there's the view that the more you tighten up the sanctions regime, the weaker the government will get, and the more people will rebel against their government. And obviously, this is not happening. So I want to tell you a little bit more about this disconnect that you have between imposing sanctions and then not looking at the actual results. At one point, I think it was in 1996, then Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was asked by a journalist, kind of point blank, and she didn't really have time to think much about the answer. But basically, she was asked, all those sanctions against Iraq have resulted in the death of 500,000 children in Iraq, and was it worth it? And then her answer was, yes, it was worth it. Okay. Now, after that, she went on to say that it was the stupidest thing she's ever said. And from that time on, the big focus, as far as the government was concerned, was on so-called smart sanctions or intelligent sanctions. And if you were to look at the Colin Powell's policy in his first year as Secretary of State, it was essentially to devise a system of smart sanctions, one that would hurt the government, and not the people. And obviously, it's very difficult to figure that one out, but that was at least the official goal. So when you look at the whole politics of the sanction regime, there's a lot of talk about smart sanctions and all sorts of kind of bureaucratic mumbo-jumbo about such things as targeted sanctions, cascading sanctions, there's a whole discourse on that, which when you look concretely at what goes on in terms of the effect of the sanctions makes absolutely no sense. It's simply some adjective that some bureaucrats in some government agency add. Again, when I give talks in Washington, usually I spend quite a bit of time explaining how the sanction regimes and how the financial war could be reformed to be more effective in terms of going after the real bad guys and not causing collateral damage. Because essentially, what has been going on with the financial war on terror is that there's not a single terrorist attack that was foiled because of the money trail. There have been some that have been foiled because of intelligence, etc., but none through the money trail. Yet at the same time, it causes lots of headaches to every financial institution, to name only the thing that can affect like a certain class of people that might be cared about in Washington. But if you look at the actual mass of people in all those countries that are victims of the financial war on terror, then you have a great increase in misery and all sorts of human tragedy that is completely ignored by those who impose these kinds of sanctions. Now, I'm going to give you just a few examples, and I'll stop there to take some questions. But I'm going to give you a few examples of the dysfunctions of the financial war, where you have complete kind of innocent bystanders who are caught in the dragnet. I gave you the example of Mr. Senura, who a few years ago was again labeled for a few days a financier of terrorism. And in the U.S., you probably know the names of like Bob Dole, who had been the presidential candidate, and Frank Carlucci, former defense secretary. All of those people were reported by their banks as possible terrorist financiers or money launderers. And that's simply because any financial institution, and now Lebanon and kind of the rest of the world are all part of that, is supposed to be filing what's called suspicious activities report, and that every time there is a movement of cash, then you're supposed to be filing a report. Now, in the U.S., it's estimated that about 2 million such reports are filed every year. It's estimated also that only about 5% are looked at, but that gives you a sense, again, of those bureaucratic dysfunctions. So there was a bank in Washington called Riggs Bank, and a few years ago there was an offensive by the government to go after Riggs Bank, mostly because there was an expectation that the Saudi embassy in Washington would be caught, again, in terms of some of its financial dealings. Now, the interesting outcome of that was that the person who was really caught and was the real victim of the Riggs Bank was Pinochet of Chile, who turned out to have been laundering his money through that bank. But part of what was done following this Riggs Bank scandal was that all the employees of Riggs Bank were told to systematically file those suspicious activities reports every time there is a certain amount of cash. So this is how, again, well-known and very prominent Washington figures could be accused for kind of, at least for a few days, of being possibly money launderers or terrorist financiers. Now imagine that your name is not Bob Dole, but is in like an Arab-sounding name, and then you can see again how you could get into this trap. There's a name you probably all know here, the journalist Michael Young, who once wrote a funny piece which was titled, I think, A Perfect Storm of Stupidity, where he told about how his bank account in Washington was closed because he was a resident of Lebanon. So you see all sorts of very, very bizarre outcomes of this financial war on terror. Again, I could go on for hours, but I'm going to stop here. Thank you very much for listening, and maybe we'll have a few questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Timur Gökçe from PSPA department. I'm a bit curious why there was no reference in your talk to the most famous figure in this, Stuart Levy, the counterterrorism chief or something in Treasury Department, as far as I know. Right? This is a gentleman who spends half of his year in Israel trying to identify Arab target banks, and his main function in the Middle East has been to target banks, Iranian and Arab banks, by blackmail, actually, scaring them. And so nobody's touching anybody's money nowadays. So I think this man has a key role in this whole activity.
Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
The question I wanted to ask is,
yeah,
the Americans, by going after, especially this Mr. Levy and his team, by going after the bank's role in transferring money, what they are doing actually is, now the bank's transfers are traceable. It's their own paper. There's a paper trail. Even Western Union. So what's happening now, but in the Middle East, we have an alternative system of sending money. So we are now forcing everybody to use those alternative means over which the Americans can dream of finding a trail of the Hawala system.
Yeah.
I mean, today you can go to the guy here. So I want to send $50,000 to Yemen.
Sure.
In half an hour, the money is in Yemen. So now you are scaring me not to use the bank, so I'm using these guys. So.
No, that's a very important question. And basically, one of these indirect impacts of the financial war is that you told real terrorists exactly what not to do in order to not get caught. Because to illustrate that point, and if you're in the financial sector, you'd be very familiar with that, the SWIFT system of money transfers, which is based in Belgium, is completely controlled by both the Treasury Department and the CIA. And this was an open secret in the realm of finance. Everybody knew that all financial transfers could be traced by the U.S. And the New York Times disclosed that in 2006. There was a huge outcry on the grounds that, it's a known fact. And one of the net results of the financial war on terror is that there's been a huge increase in the informal and the underground economy, which is much more difficult to trace because the formal economy is very easy to trace. Now you're talking about this gentleman, Stuart Levy from the Treasury Department. Now he and his other colleagues spend about 2/3 of their time going to various Middle Eastern countries and saying you should do more about terrorism, terrorist financing. And essentially it's become a kind of a game that is played whereby, especially in places like Dubai, where because of the proximity to Iran and the close ties to Iran, banks there, et cetera, are asked to quote unquote do more about terrorist financing. Now what ends up happening is that at the end of each of those trips, there's a press conference where, which is kind of proclamation of victory, where basically, again, the bureaucrat who went on this trip says, yes, now there are concessions made by the UAE and by the bankers, and there's going to be this new measure in terms of tightening the screws on Iran, etc., which also illustrates the point I was making earlier, that the success is measured in terms of these kinds of cosmetic actions, whereas the reality of it is that, for one thing, the groups that are supposed to be targeted by these actions find other ways of having money. In the case of Hamas, for example, there was the episode that you may remember where when Mr. Haniya left the country and got pledges of money from different places, including Qatar and others, let alone some like Iran, he returned to the Gaza Strip with about 20 suitcases full of cash that Hamas had received. Right now, you all hear about those tunnels and whatever goes through in terms of those tunnels. Now, obviously, it makes life miserable and horrible to the people who live in these places, but money still flows. So the whole idea of targeting the money makes absolutely no sense in a context of an open economy, a free market economy where everybody is encouraged to liberalize their economic systems and opening up their regimes. And yet, you impose these sanctions. But then you can have small bureaucratic victories that some mid-level Washington official can claim by saying, well, I got this government to do this and this government to do that, etc. And so yeah, but that was a very good question. Yeah, Shibli?
So, you know, I think the book is great, and it's a deconstruction of immense efforts with no purpose. But this fight also is one of frustration. And part of the positive dimensions, in some cases, we can see, for instance, in the Makhlouf dimension in Syria. So we have very little we can go about with regard to the actions of the Syrian government. And when one sees that at least someone who is in the position of Makhlouf is not going scot-free, and that he has some constraints put on him with regard to his assets in Europe or elsewhere, even though we know that ultimately it's not going to remove the regime in Damascus, it's still one of those actions that in good conscience one would have to support. So my question is, it's true that the overall picture is rather gloomy in terms of efficiency, because the political dimension ultimately is the one you have to deal with. But in terms of a number of targeted dimensions of this sort, I'm not sure I would share the total inefficiency of an action like this.
Now, what happens in this kind of situation that occasionally there might be some kind of real villains, etc., that it might have kind of limited impact. But if you look at this specific action that you mentioned in terms of the general rule of law, what is really happening is that you have a system where anybody that you don't like is labeled a terrorist. And then you take action against that person. So in some cases, it might be deserved, etc. But the overall principle, and this is pretty much what has been going on. Now, closer to Lebanon, there was an action, there was an executive order by President Bush, I think it was on August 2nd, 2007, which basically was worded in a very broad way. It was basically saying that anybody who undermines the Lebanese government can, like any U.S. citizen sending money that could end up undermining the Lebanese government, could have his assets frozen. Now, at the time, I had talked to some of my contacts in Washington to get a sense of what was really going on. And quite simply, it was that you had the Metin by-elections a week later. And there had been talk of a lot of money coming from the U.S. to like a certain camp in Lebanon in those elections. So it was really a way of scaring some people into spending money. Now, I think that, like in terms of what democracy is supposed to be about and the system of laws is supposed to be about, once you start engaging in those actions, regardless of the merits in the specific instance, but the fact that you can use that is something I think that is very dangerous. And to give you, like to go further in terms of how a designation can really be very dangerous, up to about 4 months ago, Nelson Mandela was on the US terrorist lists, okay? And it took a special law to remove him from that list, simply because a few weeks later, his 90th birthday was going to happen, and there were going to be kind of lots of situations that might prove embarrassing. But that's an example of how, because very often when you talk to the people in Washington, they say, oh, but he's a terrorist, or he's labeled a terrorist, etc. And the ease with which people could be put on those lists is really scary. So in terms of its consequences, because you can find yourself in this kind of netherland of kind of being put on one of those lists and not be removed. That although, again, so it's all this kind of whole old principle of democratic philosophy in terms of like one bad guy getting away versus many good guys being snared into it, which is what I really object to. So again, I won't get into the specifics of my recommendations, but part of it involves, again, having a much tighter legal system in terms of the designations, etc. Yep.
My name is Wafia. I came from the US, came back to Lebanon as a Fulbright scholar 4 years ago. I just had 3 publications about Islamic finance. And I think that the financial war on terror was a blessing for the Middle East, because many people took their money out of the US and brought it back to the Middle East, which contributed to the prosperity and the growth of Islamic finance. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, since you are an expert in Islamic finance, do you think that there is still some suspicion that Islamic finance is being used as a cover or a way for laundering money? Mm-hmm. A second question is, how did the embassy discover that Senora contributed to charity, to the Islamic charity? And didn't they worry that this would be taken as something against Islam instead of something against terrorism? One more thing, which is you did not mention the legend which was spread around September 11, which is that bin Laden was that smart that he shorted the insurance stocks and the airline stocks and contributed to their decline.
Yeah, I don't like to start with the last part of it. I looked very closely at that rumor, and I wrote an article for Le Monde Diplomatique on that, and I don't think there was anything to it. But there's, again, this tendency to try and attribute like or to try and kind of like when you look at an act such as September 11, then you can kind of elaborate all sorts of scenarios, etc. But on the other parts of your question, following September 11, Sandy Berger, who was the last national security advisor of Bill Clinton, made a statement about the financial war, saying, and I think I'm quoting him correctly here, he said, you cannot get to the terrorist money because it's all hidden in informal finance, Islamic finance. So, there were people who would readily associate the two. Now, there's another quote, again, I have it in my book, but it will take me a few minutes to find it, so I'd rather not. But basically, Paul O'Neill, who was the first Treasury Secretary, said, I think in March of 2002, he said, it took me 6 months to learn that Islamic finance was not about financing terrorism. So what had happened following that was that the Treasury Department created a position of scholar in residence in Islamic finance. And about 3 weeks ago, there was a conference at the Treasury Department that was titled Islamic Finance 101 to try and explain Islamic finance to regulators. And on the day this happened, the whole right-wing blogosphere went crazy. All the neoconservative publications started saying, oh, now the US government is promoting terrorism, etc. And so the position of the US government is ambivalent in that there are many people in the US government who, just like the position of Gordon Brown in the UK, look at Islamic finance as a positive thing in terms of better integration of Muslims within Western societies. And then you have like a counter movement which basically tries to say that Islamic finance is very dangerous and allowing Islamic banks to operate like in the US would be very dangerous for the US, for national security, etc. So there is some ambivalence, but the official position of the US government is that there's nothing wrong with Islamic banks. But again, it's a more complicated picture. So if you've looked at my book, I get into that in some detail. Okay. There's a gentleman there who had his up for a while, and then we'll have the, yeah.
Hi, Christopher Kiefer, undergraduate and Faculty of Art and Science. I thought it was really interesting of your view upon that if money is the oxygen of terrorism, but I couldn't help thinking of an article that I read the other day, which made me, together with what you said today, like think that the cost of an act of terrorism is just the tip of the iceberg of the cost of terrorism. Because this article was about a regional political leader in Peshawar, and he was saying that he tried to raise money all around the world to be able to finance school in his region, because the Taliban in Peshawar was founding schools in his region in a way to make his region a recruiting ground and also like a training ground and everything. So you need to have a big support to be able to carry out these terrorist attacks, and that support you can only get with money. And from this perspective, couldn't money be oxygen for terrorism?
Mm-hmm. Well, the word oxygen has such important connotation that I think that the real oxygen of terrorism is politics and political grievance, etc. Money is a facilitator. Obviously, if you want to blow something up and you have money, it will make you more dangerous. But I think that we should also put that in the context of how technology and also political actions have transformed the whole picture. There was a time, certainly at the time of Libyan-sponsored terrorism, where you needed to have things like training camps, etc. And post-September 11, however, the whole organizational element of terrorism has weakened a great deal. And what you have a number of authors who have talked about the more kind of a franchise system of terrorism rather than having a big bureaucracy. So money is still a factor, and there's still ways of combating it. But I think that systems have become far more decentralized, where, for example, you have the internet that has become not only a huge recruiting tool, as well as a fundraising tool, incidentally, but also in terms of putting people together, making acts of terror possible, even things like cell phones in terms of coordination, etc. So the technology has driven the cost so low that that assuming that money is really at the center of it, I think mistakes the hierarchy of problems, because I think it should be part of the arsenal, but it shouldn't be the central part, because of the logistics, especially in the post-September 11 environment. So people at the Treasury Department always say, oh yes, sure, acts of terror don't cost money, but the whole infrastructure that's needed to make those acts of terror possible costs a lot of money. Now, this part is not necessarily true, but even if it were, I think that the whole question of money has become so broad and so tricky and working in so many different ways that we should think of a few instances where, for example, in Iraq, you know, part of this much touted surge consisted in essentially the US government, until about a month ago or so, giving money to many of the Sunni insurgents. In other words, people who were labeled terrorists were given money to. Okay? Now that shows how murky this whole question is and how arbitrary it is in the end, and why it should be treated in a much more delicate and nuanced view, which at the same time I think politically doesn't make sense. In other words, very often people had been asking me, now within the Obama presidency, do you think the financial war is going to change? And my answer is, why should it change? In that they're kind of politically, it makes perfect sense, and bureaucratically, it makes perfect sense. And the fact that there's a whole lot of collateral damage is very much outside of the field of vision of politicians. It's something that they don't necessarily care about. So why should it change?
My name is Paul Markovs. I'm a graduate student visiting from the U.S. here for 2 semesters and doing some research in banking. First, I had a comment on his comment about Waladars. Technically, I believe there are new rules in the Middle East where all Waladars need to be registered. I don't know if that was something started in Saudi or in Bahrain. I don't know if those are instituted, but I believe those are in effect or supposed to be in effect. I'm not sure. And second, I was hoping you could comment more a little bit about on the fight on the financing of terrorism, but from a charity perspective. I have not had a chance to read your book, but I have read some of the comments online about your book, specifically angrily saying that the FATF notes that there are tons of charities funding terrorism, et cetera, which you say may or may not exist. I have not read your book, but I would tend to agree that charities do exist that do fund these organizations, and I don't want to get an argument of defining terrorists or terrorism, but for example, the Chechens in Chechnya were definitely, I believe, funded by many, many charities in the U.S., and technically those have all been shut down, or they're supposed to have been, so I was hoping you can comment on
Well, obviously there are lots of charities who have done very unsavory things, but the real issue is in the U.S. there's a whole, those of you who know the U.S. know that there's a whole industry there whose job it is to associate Islamic charities with terrorism. That is, you have books written about that, etc. In other words, people who say that charitable organizations exist to fund terrorism. Now, when you explain to them that there is such thing as the in my book, actually, I go to great lengths to show, again, this kind of a discourse, which is, again, part of this very anti-Islamic discourse in certain circles, where people want to associate the two things. Now, the other thing about using a quote from some report and say that's proof that the overall statement is true is really like the Dick Cheney method. If you look at every time Dick Cheney wanted to make a statement about something, like for example that Iraq is an imminent threat to the U.S., then he would make that statement, and then the next part of it is very interesting in terms of linguistic analysis. The second part of it would be to say, yeah, and Fuad Ajami just told me that, okay? Or Bernard Lewis just told me that. So it was always like a very broad statement and then one quote. So I know that I've been very flattered by the attacks I've received on the part of some neoconservatives. And the typical, like one of those attacks by a guy named Matthew Levitt, who makes a career of attacking all things Islamic, was to say that there is this FATF report that said that Islamic charities have funded terrorism. Therefore, I should read that. And that's pretty much the extent, the gist of his book review. And the part that is very important to understand is that Islamic charities are a very complex and very historically rich phenomenon. Now, what happens, especially in a failed state, is that all organizations, including charities in a failed state, tend to reflect the characteristics of that failed state. So if you go to any place, if you go to Afghanistan now, and especially in places where you don't really have much of kind of a civil society and government institutions, you're going to have this kind of murky world of people who would kind of invoke religion, etc., to raise money. But what has happened was that the fact that some charities might have been involved in terrorism has resulted in people, and you can see those statements. There are books written where basically the argument is that the reason why those companies exist is to fund terrorism. And so I think this is the part that is very, very dangerous in terms of, again, like getting the Islamic world to see that, well, maybe they could contribute to the war on terror. But then when you have things like that, which are kind of deeply insulting to all Muslims. And so if you look at the broad picture of that, it would be like, again, catching someone who committed a crime and saying that this person belongs to a given faith or a given ethnic group, etc. That's not proof that the entire ethnic group is. And even I think probably most Muslim leaders would agree that if an Islamic charity is caught in terrorist financing, it should be prosecuted. But the perverse impact of that was that in the US, those charities that have come under attack are basically mainstream charities that have lots of controls, etc. But then you start with the assertion that Islamic charities equal terrorism, therefore we're going to go after this charity. And the people who get caught are, again, people in Gaza and kind of innocent donors. So I think that it is the broad brush characterizations of the raison d'etre of charities being to fund terrorism and get into those things, which many people believe very strongly. That is, you have lots of people very militant. I mentioned Stephen Emerson, but there's a whole bunch of people around him who share that belief, and many people sincerely believe it. For others, it's more of a kind of an agit-prop thing. They figure, well, they're going to try to kind of make things worse for Muslims, etc. But so I think it's an empirical question. Kind of once you find unsavory acts, it's the duty of law enforcement to go after that. But starting as an assertion to say that Islamic charities exist in order to fund terrorism, this is, I think, the part that is worth criticizing.
I'm interested actually in what Wafia was saying about the financial war on terror driving money back into the region and boosting liquidity here. Have you studied this, or do you have any figures you could share with us?
Yeah. It's estimated that following all the freezing of accounts, etc., that $200 billion left the U.S. To come kind of all over like some went to Switzerland, etc., but a lot of it went to the home countries. Now, very often the home countries were kind of too small in terms of their markets to absorb that. It was reflected in real estate booms, stock market booms, etc. But there were other things, like one thing that I've been looking at is Malaysia. A lot of money went to Malaysia at the time, and it also ended up kind of building ties between Malaysia and the Arab world. So so you're right, that was a very significant part of the impact of the financial war. And right now, actually, I think some money is coming back. There's less paranoia. But there was a time where there was complete paranoia that also kind of reappeared at the time of the recent presidential campaign, where, again, in the last weeks of the McCain campaign, there were kind of lots of people trying to make the association that you probably saw on television, like this woman saying, "But isn't Obama an Arab?" So again, and then people in the crowds would be shouting, "Terrorists, terrorists!" So that was kind of one of the ugly sides of what has been going on in the U.S. in the last few years. Because right now I'm just updating my book on Islamic finance, and one thing that's interesting is that, like in Islamic finance, you cannot sell debt, you cannot have short selling, you cannot do kind of a bunch of things, which mean that things like the subprime crisis wouldn't normally take place if Islamic finance was applied properly. Although obviously you can lose money on things like right now the real estate bust in the Gulf region, but still, yeah, that's very much in line with what's being said. Okay, thank you very much for coming.